Welcome to a Readapalooza Deep Dive featuring Kerry, Agins, and Matt Horsberger. They discuss advocacy and the science of reading. Hi everyone, I'm David Brobeck from Walsh University, and welcome to this follow-up session of the Readapalooza. Today we're very pleased to bring to you additional information from attorney Kerry Agins and Matt Horsberger. Matt both were presenters at the Readapalooza, and I'm going to stop and turn it over to Kerry.
All right, thank you so much, David. David reached out to some of the speakers after the Readapalooza and asked us if we would be willing to do a deeper dive into some of our topics. There appeared to have been some interest from the participants to have a little bit of additional information. When I asked him if there was anything specific that he thought would be helpful for our particular presentation, he said whatever we thought would benefit participants the most. So in an effort to put some talking points together, what I wanted to focus on in this particular session was a deeper dive into finding information on structured literacy, or the science of reading, and how that can be implemented as an intervention with a little bit more attention to the requirements of structured literacy. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. I actually welcome questions while I'm presenting. I know that everyone is muted and everyone has their microphones off. There is a chat box that's open for you to submit questions. David, if you wouldn't mind, if there's a question that is submitted while I'm speaking, feel free to interrupt and go ahead and bring the question up so that we can get to that in turn. All right, so I'm going to share screen and go to the PowerPoint. All right. Let's see. So a lot of times that I give this particular presentation, I'm talking to parents, and usually parents struggle to understand what their role is in the IEP process and what their role is in a participant at the table. I encourage parents to be equal and meaningful participants in the process, but to maintain a professional and a collaborative tone and effort whenever possible. I know that there are reasonable, responsible differences of opinion that exist between parents who are strong advocates and teachers who are often also very strong advocates for their students. And when we're talking about kind of the I in IEP for parents, it is knowing your rights in the process, researching policies, understanding how the laws work and how to align your child's needs with a big document that you may or may not understand, being prepared with data and questions to support their requests, and making sure that the child is the focus of the conversation. And if you'll remember back to the Readapalooza, that was the focus of what I wanted to convey. So what does it mean to receive structured literacy with fidelity? And how do we review structured literacy, components of structured literacy against fidelity components, and how do we ensure that reading instruction is provided, particularly for intervention, that includes the elements and principles identified in the research? And the first place that I encourage everyone to start is with the review of the International Dyslexia Association's Knowledge and Practice Standards. The IDA has done a really nice job of summarizing via their fact sheets the components of structured literacy, why structured literacy is important for students that have reading disabilities, why structured literacy is important for any student that struggles with reading, And if you were a part of the Readapalooza, you'll know that we advocate structured literacy, not just for students as an intervention, but for students as a Tier 1 reading program. What we know about structured literacy is that it includes and weaves together all of the strands that are recommended by the National Reading Panel for teaching reading to students. We find that when attention is paid to all of those strands, particularly the phonemic awareness and the phonics strands, that children learn how to read with more efficiency and effectiveness. And the fact sheets that are outlined here through the IDA summarizes the research in an easy to read, easy to understand format for both parents and instructors. It's really helpful for people that are new to the world of dyslexia and new to the world of structured literacy in outlining different components, different research, different ways that the science of reading aligns to diagnoses and other elements that we see in providing interventions for students with reading needs. So I include the link to the fact sheet here and a review of the knowledge and practice standards. And there is a foundation to the practice standards that includes the elements of the methods for teaching reading. So when we're talking about teaching reading effectively based on the science of reading, we're talking about explicit, systematic, cumulative, and multisensory instruction. And all of those elements are further defined by other individuals that gave the Readapalooza. And my guess is other individuals that will be doing deeper dives as we schedule more of our deep dive sessions. So I would encourage you, if you have questions about what that means, to look to either the Readapalooza recordings that are posted, and I know David will give you that information before we finish today. But go back and review those for the elements, what it means to be explicit, systematic, cumulative, and multisensory. We're also looking for instruction that is multilinguistic, that teaches the structure of language at all levels, most importantly, phonology and orthography, syntax, morphology, word phrase meanings, and the organization of written and spoken language. If we can include the structure, and that structure is created in the programs and the instruction that we're providing to students, what we find is that a greater percentage of students learn to read without additional intervention. If we are waiting to provide structured literacy as kind of a level 2 or level 3 intervention program, then we're finding the need to ensure that the intervention programs that we are selecting clearly provide all of those elements. And so as a parent or as a teacher who is selecting the intervention that a student may need, I would encourage you to look at some of the following things. I would encourage you to know the knowledge and practice standards. So when I say KPS, that's what I mean. Know what the knowledge and practice standards are, carefully review those, and ask the team or the teacher who's implementing the reading program what reading program is being used. How is the reading program that was identified for the use with this particular student aligned to the knowledge and practice standards? Do we know whether or not the intervention program that we've selected, and sometimes teachers are limited in what they can use for an intervention program by the selection of curriculum at the district level. So for district level folks, I encourage you to really conduct a hard analysis of the curriculums that you've purchased and that you're using and what you've identified in your district for Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions against the knowledge and practice standards. Do a clear alignment. Sometimes this has already been done for you by the International Dyslexia Association. They have reports on different reading interventions and whether or not they align to the practice standards, so that can be really helpful. If they have not, do that internal review. Then I would encourage you to look at the intervention programs that are being selected. Go to the publisher's website. There will be information on the publisher's website about the conditions under which the program was researched. And if those conditions were such that the research was aligned to the need of students with reading disabilities. So we're kind of starting at this top level big picture. What does the research say about teaching reading? Then we're drilling it down to whether or not this particular curriculum has it. Then we're drilling into, is this particular curriculum appropriate for students with reading disabilities? Then we're drilling into, how does this program need to be implemented in order for it to reach those research outcomes? Because a program is only considered evidence-based if we are implementing it according to the structure that was in place at the time that that evidence and research was conducted. So what's really important is that we know as educators and as parents, what does the research tell us about how this particular program is supposed to be implemented? What is the professional development needed to successfully implement the program, and what is that supposed to look like? Once we have that general information, and it's much more broadly available online than you might think. If you haven't done this research before, I can tell you that most publishers of reading programs have this information readily available on their websites, because that's the information that we're supposed to be using as educators in order to select these programs. And as a marketing tool, they're publishing all of this information. So it's readily available to you both as an educator and as a consumer or parent to see what the research is telling us. Once we have that general information, we can then drill it down to the individual child level. And that's where we start to...
A question that came in
Yes.
about how can they make sure that the curriculum is implemented correctly to meet these things?
So in terms of ensuring that the curriculum is implemented correctly, there are several components. So number one, you're going to be looking at the professional development that is required for staff to understand the curriculum and how to implement it. All publishers will have recommended professional development. It isn't enough to buy a program and hand it to a teacher. And I don't say that because I don't believe teachers know how to teach. I say that because when you're given a special program, there is a set of skills that underlie the way that the program is delivered, particularly when you're talking about multisensory intervention and explicit, cumulative, direct intervention. And so it's those underlying skills that you need to make sure are firm before you simply hand someone a product and expect it to be implemented. So typically you're doing that through appropriate professional development, ongoing review of the implementation, and then of course the data collection. And so when I get to the next slide, we'll talk about what does the data show you about how it's being implemented in your district or with your students. If the data that you're getting isn't aligning to the research data that the publisher told you you should be getting, then there's a gap. There's either a gap in the way that you're implementing the program, or there's a gap that the program was not intended to fill that you're trying to get it to do. So that's kind of where you get to the last analysis. So I want to just, before we get to that big piece on data, I want to talk about the implementation phase. So once we've done the research about what the program, how it should be implemented, we need to actually provide the instruction that way. So have we properly baselined the student into the program? most programs will come with some kind of baseline assessment for you to give to the student, or some protocol for baseline assessment using existing standardized measures for you to enter the student into the right level of the program. So of course, question number one, and I'm looking at this from an IEP perspective about an individual child, but this is going to apply regardless of whether you're implementing it with one student or all students. Is the child properly baselined into the program? Have you then established goals and objectives aligned to the scope and sequence of the program so that we know what the expected growth is for the period of time in which we're measuring? So if we're doing a traditional response to intervention procedure, we're going to be looking at what is the period of time for intervention. Usually we're doing 6 to 12 weeks. During that period of time for intervention, what is our goal? We should define that goal. It should be measurable. It should be clear. And it should align to the scope and sequence of the program, because you're relying on a specific sequential introduction of concepts, because that is what is required of the knowledge and practice standards for the instruction of students with reading disabilities. So this is kind of how this is all coming together. Is there adequate time allocated for intervention? I can tell you that is the death knell of most intervention programs, that there is not adequate time allocated for intervention. And when you look at the research upon which the success of the program was based, typically reading intervention for students with disabilities within a program is 45 to 60 minutes daily. I see a lot of intervention that is provided in 20 to 30 minute increments 3 to 5 times a week. And that's simply not enough time. You're not going to meet the goals of the intervention if you aren't using the research constraints. So is adequate time allocated? Another issue that we need to look at when we're talking about fidelity is the group sized appropriately? If the intervention is intended to only be for 3 to 6 students at a time, and you're delivering it to a group of 12 to 20, how is that group size impacting fidelity? And I can tell you almost 100% of the time, the way that it's impacting fidelity is that the students in the group are not homogeneous enough for the instruction to be effective. You're trying to instruct within a 45 to 60 minute block students that are at all different levels within the program. What happens then is that you're diluting the amount of time that you need for intervention for all of the students. And so we end up with a lack of fidelity, again, because our group size is too big, we're trying to do too much, then we don't have enough time, we're instructing at the wrong level, or we're not allowing the student to pace through the program based on mastery of skill. Progress monitoring aligned to the program, and I'm going to skip certification for a minute, go to progress monitoring aligned to the program, because that's how we can determine whether or not we're being successful. So most programs have a built-in progress monitoring philosophy or assessment. So if we are teaching, and most structured literacy programs require teaching to mastery, if we're teaching to mastery, we have to be able to move students through the program in a homogeneous enough group that we have some kids that aren't moving really fast, some kids that are moving really slow, and suddenly the pacing of our program has moved our group all over the place. So that's where group size, time, homogeneous grouping, and progress monitoring all come into play in order to ensure fidelity. And then finally, does the instructor have the required certification or training to properly implement the program? What you're going to find with structured literacy programs is the more flexible the program is, the higher level of certification required for the teacher to implement it. And that's because if the staff is given a lot of flexibility in how things are introduced or the sequence in which things are going to occur, they have to understand the science behind why things work and don't work in order to properly tailor the program. Some of the structured literacy programs that have been approved for use of students with disabilities are very scripted. Those scripted programs require lower levels of certification for staff because they don't have a lot of independent judgment in terms of how to implement it. So there's sometimes a trade-off between the level of flexibility of the program and the intensity of certification required for staff. And I think you can see why with that kind of explanation. Once we're putting together our intervention procedures to align in that way, then we need to implement the program with fidelity and collect the progress monitoring data appropriately. Once we collect the data, we have the hard work of making sure it's working. And I think this is a step that we don't do as clearly as we need to. And I say that for parents, I say it for instructors and teachers, and I say it for district level administrators as well. Simply buying a program isn't enough. We need to make sure that the children are progressing through the program at an appropriate rate of progress. If a program is intended to be provided over the course of approximately 2 to 3 years, and we have kids that are in year 5 of this program and they're only halfway through, there's something that's not working. Are we finding that our RTI goals are being met? If our RTI goals are not being met, why not? Is it because of our size? Is it because of our professional development? Is it because we're not using all components of the program? I have kind of an interesting story. There was a district in suburban Cleveland, and I will allow them to remain nameless. They were implementing Wilson, which is a structured literacy program. Their teachers had been trained. They had gotten a 30-hour overview. They were not certified as level 1 Wilson providers. And so there was some disconnect between the professional development that was recommended and what the staff had received. They were implementing Wilson in a half-an-hour block 3 days a week. So again, there was a disconnect between the program recommendation, which was for 45 to 60 minutes, sometimes more if you're doing groups, and what they were implementing. And they had decided, because of that discrepancy, that instead of implementing all 10 steps of the lesson, that they would only do the reading portion of the lesson and not the spelling portion of the lesson. And they reasoned that the kids were identified with reading disabilities, not written expression disabilities, and so they only needed the reading component. Unfortunately, that takes away some of the science about why these programs work. When we're introducing both the spoken and the written together, we see a lot more growth with students. And so we took away program targets, we took away objective measures, and then suddenly we were wondering why it wasn't working. When they started to implement all 10 strands of the program and intensified the level of instruction, they saw much more significant improvement among their student population with the implementation of the program. So it's really kind of exciting when we start to analyze our data, what it tells us. Are skills retained and demonstrated with automaticity? So one thing that we need to do is we need to look at programmatic or curriculum-based assessments to make sure students are moving through. We need to use our objective standardized measurements to make sure we're demonstrating student progress. And then we also need to take a look at, are the kids retaining the skills? Are they being paced through the program quickly enough that they're gaining progress, but slowly enough that they're able to learn the skills to mastery, meaning they can use the skill with some automaticity. They've developed the ability to read through and to use the skills that they're learning in a way that isn't very labored. And the reason we develop skills to automaticity is so that we can continue to build on them. If students are still having to struggle to decode simple closed syllables and we've moved them through a program well beyond that phase, the frustration builds. And we don't want to build frustration with intervention, we want to alleviate it. And then finally, are you achieving growth relative to the student's ability? So when you're looking at that from an individual level, is the student achieving where they should be based on their internal or their inherent ability? When you're looking at that from a systems-wide objective, are your students growing relative to their abilities? Are you finding that using these programs as tier 2 or tier 3 interventions, that they're working, that the students are starting to close the gap, that fewer students are having to be referred for identification, that fewer students are having to be in the program later into their educational careers? Our goal is to try to remediate, try to do it as systematically as possible so that our students can achieve more independence earlier in their educational careers. And so those are the kinds of things that we're going to look for in order to see if it's working. Why advocate? Because we care. I mean, nobody goes into education because they don't care about kids. That's just not why people become teachers. They become teachers because they want to shape students and they want to help them grow. And most parents want the same thing. So the one thing that I know, even as a parent attorney and even as somebody who at times has had to, kind of go to battle with a school district to get what I feel the student needs, is that more often than not, everybody has the same objective. And if we have the same objective, but just different ways of getting there, usually we can work it out. And so as long as we keep in mind the student as the focus of what we're doing, it makes a lot of sense. Wanted to share some additional sources for developing advocacy skills, and I think that these skills can be helpful, not just for parents, but also for teachers. I know that many teachers are advocating for their students in districts where resources are short and funding isn't necessarily there to provide the services that you feel like your children need. So being a good advocate is not something parents alone need to learn how to do. There are some resources specifically for parents. The Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates is exclusive to parent attorneys, advocates, and parents. If you are an educator, you are not invited to participate in the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. It's a safe place for parents, and often they vent some of their frustration within that realm. The International Dyslexia Association and their local branches, however, is a wonderful collaborative group. In Ohio, we've got 3 branches of the IDA. We have Northern, Central, and the Ohio Valley. They are amazing collaborative groups with both parents and professionals, and the programs that they put on are incredible. Rightslaw.com is a great resource for advocacy and information about the law and special education. And then there are a lot of state and local resources. When I say P&A, I mean protection and advocacy. Every state has a protection and advocacy arm for people with disabilities. In Ohio, it's Ohio Legal Rights. They're named different things in different states, but if you Google your state and protection and advocacy, you should get who your state P&A arm is. There are a lot of parent support groups that you can encourage parents to join to learn more about advocacy. And OH Kid, I just wanted to give them a plug. OH Kid is an organization of parents and professionals who have grouped together to encourage the implementation of structured literacy for students with dyslexia statewide. OH Kid is kind of a head organization of a number of other parent groups that are organizing more locally, started by some parents in Upper Arlington who advocated successfully for their students to get the systematic implementation of structured literacy within their district. We're seeing success in a lot of Central Ohio districts, Olentangy, New Albany. We're seeing some growth in Westerville And in Medina, we are seeing parent groups all over the place support the implementation of structured literacy within their school districts. And so on that note, I just wanted to kind of let you know how we're taking this information and then really drilling it into down to the student level. Is it working? How can we be better advocates for meeting the needs of students using the science of reading? And hopefully with some of these strategies, there's a little bit of a roadmap for getting from this big picture science of reading to what about the products we're selecting and using to making sure that they're working for individual students and driving our decision making.
And Kerry, you have a couple questions that have come in while you're sliding here. One of them is, let me see, I missed it. Sorry.
I'm going to stop share just so that I can see.
Yeah, hit stop share. And how often, the question was, how often should the progress be shared with families? And then how do you recommend that families should be invited prior to the writing of the RIMP to provide insight?
I love that question. I think that information should be provided to parents as often as you're doing the assessments that would generate some cumulative assessment. So obviously before writing a RIMP, you're identifying the need for a RIMP based on assessment. I would share the results of the assessment initially prior to the RIMP, and then I would put together a process whereby you let the parent know what a RIMP is and why one is being developed, and then offer them an opportunity either to confer with the child's teacher, district literacy specialist, whoever the point of contact should be, to confer, in this day and age, of course, via video conference, and then to review a draft of the RIMP before it is finalized at a meeting. I have had a lot of parents tell me that they were told their child needed a RIMP, sent one in the mail, they never signed off on it. They get the same one every year. They don't know whether or not it's working. The RIMP itself is supposed to include a schedule of data collection and reporting. I would encourage districts to use no more than a 9-week reporting cycle. If you have trimesters instead of quarters at your school, I would suggest you do a 6-week and a 12-week. If you have quarters, depending on the trajectory and the goals that you're building in the RIMP, quarters can be frequent enough. The one thing I would caution you, though, is that if you're in a RIMP and you have a child that you suspect has a disability, don't let that RIMP go too long without doing your child find obligations under IDEA and conducting an evaluation. A child find issue can be problematic for a district. So just be very careful that you understand the intersection of the RIMP, providing intervention, and when that evaluation should take place. And I would tell you the evaluation should take place sooner rather than later, and that the evaluation should take place specifically if you go through an entire RIMP cycle of data collection and do not see growth.
Okay, I'm going to move it over to the gallery so the camera can see more people. But Chandra had a question, and Chandra, would you like to ask it directly? Or do you want me to read it? It's your choice. You'd have to unmute. Second. Her questions. Go ahead.
I just wondered what you would advise parents when the district is telling you, I have a trained instructor, and you find out that they went to the weekend Wilson training and that's all they've got. And so you want somebody certified, but they tell you, I don't have anybody certified, but this person's been trained. How do you handle that?
So it depends. And I know as a lawyer, that's a really frustrating answer. It's the one I give most often. But it depends on whether or not the child is actually making progress. And I am a huge believer that Wilson recommends certification for a reason. And it's because within the teaching protocol for Wilson, they do not embed any of the strategies for multisensory sequential explicit instruction. They literally just give you a book of what the lesson should be. I actually have it. And the practicum phase of training for structured literacy is so critically important, and anyone who has ever done it would tell you that. But it doesn't matter that you want a certified person if an uncertified person is working. If the data is showing that an uncertified person is causing a student to grow and progress, we're not going to be able to fight for someone who is certified. However, if you are not seeing that a child's trajectory through the program would lead them to complete the intervention within a reasonable time frame, and for Wilson that's usually defined as about 3 to 3.5 years. If you're not going to see that a child's going to get through all 12 books within that time frame, or the group size is too big, or the intervention time is too short, you really do need to push for fidelity. And at that point, the district has the option of finding somebody who is certified to come in and provide the training, or paying for you to go and find someone who is certified to conduct the lessons and the intervention. Some districts are turning to online providers. There are a lot of online providers for structured literacy that are doing instruction via video conferencing. I was really concerned about that model until the pandemic. And I can tell you that I have seen certified Wilson and OG providers who are not missing a beat with their kids via remote instruction. And so, although it's not ideal for all kids, it is working really well for most. And with a certified individual, it's happening pretty seamlessly. So I would encourage you to research and bring solutions to the table. Bring providers to the table who can come in, who have availability during the day, who can do the work, and then push for that to happen. I also have districts who will agree to use a particular child as a practicum student for a teacher who wants to get their certification. So if a teacher has completed the 30-hour training and wants to get certified, the child may be an appropriate candidate to be their practicum student, and the district can then bring in a supervisor to conduct the practicum for that teacher. I recommend that to districts all the time. That's a great way of actually building your own internal skills, and having somebody get certified within your district means that they're there for other students. And you know, I recommend all the time that if a district is going to have to put resources into training and certification, that they really should do it among their own staff if possible.
We have a question from Beth. Would you like me to read it, Beth, or would you like to read it yourself? Or ask it yourself?
I can ask it myself. I have a very loud fan in my office and it just shut off, so I can ask it myself now since it's quiet. I was just curious if you had any recommendations or suggestions for parents on the best starting point or best ways to approach their school district if they are concerned that their district might be using curriculum or instructional practices that are not based in the science of reading. Where should they start in that conversation with their school district?
Opening a dialogue about what they are using is really important and really helpful. So I would start with a general conversation about what your child needs and ask them what they're currently using. So what does the program that they are currently using, how is that aligned to the science of reading? I would encourage you to Google studies. There are numerous studies about individual curriculums and the science of reading. Most notably, there's a lot of information about Fountas and Pinnell programs and whether or not they align to the science of reading. They don't. But there's a lot of information about that and why. And so I would just encourage you to get on the internet and do the research. But start by really talking to the district about why they made the program selection that they made, why they are using that program with your specific child, and then bring up concerns you have about why it is or isn't working. Again, we have to rely on data, and so we need to look at what is working within the program, what isn't working in the program. Sometimes I have to drill down as deep as the actual passages that are being given to the child aren't being given appropriately, or aren't being recorded correctly. And so it's really just digging and keep working. And at some point, it just kind of becomes clear that what they're doing isn't working, and we need to shift gears. And once we need to shift gears, we need to realign ourselves to the research.
Melissa, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, sure. I was just, we are reworking our RIMP, and I wondered if anybody had any examples that they could share, because ours wasn't really working for us. If there was anybody out there that had something to share.
I would suggest, Melissa, that you contact Kevin Gorman in Upper Arlington. He's the director of People Services in Upper Arlington, and they've gone through a really remarkable transformation within their district in pulling in structured literacy. They do foundations at their early grade levels, so their RIMP is pretty comprehensive. I would start by asking districts that you know are doing it well to share their copies with you. I know Kevin is really very open about sharing all of their resources, so he may be a good place to start. And then Olentangy, they are a dyslexia training school, so they've actually built a program within their school for training, and their RIMP as well has been modified, I believe, by their department, and their administration tends to be really generous as well with their feedback.
Great. Thank you for the information.
So Jeremy submitted a couple questions. One question, he did a shout out to the Upper Arlington Parent Group's video, Our Dyslexic Children, that is available on YouTube. It's 43 minutes long, and I strongly encourage you to watch that. And he had a question. Any thoughts on push-ins versus pull-out services, especially in light of Doe versus Ohio, which pushes push-in as much as possible?
Yeah, I do. I actually have really strong opinions about this. What I will tell you is that least restrictive environment is supposed to be gauged upon the needs of the child. So you should be included to the maximum extent appropriate for the child with your non-disabled peers. I like push-in for skill sets that are occurring naturally in the classroom environment. However, we do not often have structured literacy occurring within the classroom environment. And so if the skills that need to be addressed are such that they're not happening in the classroom, pull-out then becomes kind of the only option that we have left in order to do it and not disrupt the general classroom. I think that for younger grades, particularly if the schools are investing in Tier 1 curriculums that are aligned to the science of reading, there are very few school districts that are doing that. But if your school district is, then that offers an opportunity. If your district is implementing something like foundations or early literacy programs for kids K through 2, then you can usually use that as a starting point for some of your intervention. You would then be able to do some push-in during that time and then pull out for some additional support. The pull-out time would then be less. But for skills that aren't being taught in the gen ed classroom, or for skills that the other students aren't addressing, the value of push-in just really isn't there. I'm not a proponent of push-in for the sake of push-in. I'm a proponent of good remediation, and usually that needs to happen in a small group setting.
I'm going to put Matt on the spot
I
here
was
for
going
a
to say,
second.
Matt might have a feeling about that.
And for those of you, if you didn't get a chance to see Readapalooza, Matt told his story, and he won some major awards as a student who is dyslexic. He is an amazing developer of data analysis tools at Walsh University. But Matt, you want to give him a brief fill-in and any response to some of these things that parents can do to help?
I forgot I was muted there. I would say that's the hardest thing, is to have someone be an advocate for you. I was lucky enough to have parents that, went to bat for me and, asked the questions and, had the school explain exactly, what they were doing. And not every student that you have, or, that you're going to come across, is going to have a parent like that, that will be trying to get the best for, their own child. So I think it's important that, you continue to come to things like this and learn more and expand and, understand, what is best practice. It's ever evolving, it's changing all the time. And without some of the things I went through to, understand what my own dyslexia was and how to deal with it and use it, I would not be in the position that I am today and where I am today without it. So, yeah, I think that's the hardest thing about being an educator, is just being an advocate for everyone.
Matt, I'd be interested in your perspective on the question about push-in versus pull-out services as a student who was kind of in the classroom.
So I would say, so when I was going through elementary school, they didn't understand, I guess what was wrong with me, in a sense. I just couldn't read, so they decided to put me into a like traditional special ed classroom. It was self-contained, and it was limited interaction with the general peers of the grade. And I went through that for a couple of years, and eventually they decided, let's put all of these students at one elementary school. So they bused, different students across the district to one elementary school. So we were, mainstreamed with the rest of the grade at that point, but it was still evident that, we were a collective group of students that, something was going on with them. And so I preferred the hybrid model, where I was included with my peers, but like had assistance. I don't know if that's the push-in method, but I guess from my own experiences, I would say that is what I preferred. I don't know if that's the truth for everyone, but I felt for other aspects of, growing as a person, such as, like interactions, the social aspect, just receiving the same content as other students was huge for me. I felt like, okay, I have trouble reading, but like, I can still do math. I want to do math with like my peers. I still like the same projects. So I think that aspect of being a student was helpful. And I don't know. I guess it just kind of depends on the student, but I would say probably if you can have as much inclusion as you can would be ideal, I think.
I think that's a great perspective. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Does anybody, we can open up the questions now that we've covered the question box, and really it is a time to share. If you have something you'd like to ask, or there's a piece you'd like to share, please do that. We were talking connections earlier. Matt grew up in the Canton area and attended Heidelberg University. Kerry is a proud Mount Union alumnus. I've been doing this stuff. I'm entering my 46th year as an educator. So I know I probably only look like I'm like 61 or 62, but I'm a little older than that. Anyone? What I can do, I'm gonna end the recording right now, and then we'll stay on, because sometimes people like to ask questions and there's no recording. So the Readapalooza was founded as part of the Ohio P20 Collaborative. It's our objective to try and bring as much presence of the science of reading forward as we possibly can. We're also a collaborator with other colleges and universities. We're more than happy to share our information and what we're doing. It's led us to people like Kerry who are willing to help and support what we're trying to do, because the bottom line is for kids. And my line the other day was from Steve Dykstra when he said, reading is the great vaccine, because it bridges the gap of poverty and racism. And actually, when I used to work with young teachers, I told them, everybody, it's really easy to teach the popular kids who are well-dressed, well-groomed, and never hungry. The outstanding teachers figure out ways to work with everyone else. So thank you for joining us.